next topic is replacing data source, and we will just go into the data source. And why we are replacing the data source is whenever you're working in multiple data sources and you want to replace the data sources to the new one which contains new data, new updated data, new columns, or new data you have, and you want to replace the particular data source to the other data source, then you use this scenario of replace data source option. And in this replace data source option, we have some clauses. Whenever you replace the data source, the replace name should be like the new name. So whatever columns you have inside the data source should be the exactly same when you're replacing to the new data source. So that column should be the same. You can have new columns, but already existing columns should be the same. And the calculations will be mapped and they will be inbuilt into the new ones. And the category and subcategory will already be mapped from the previous versions. And this is very important. The column names are same, but if there is a different column name, you can actually redirect the column to the old column name. We will look at how we are going to do that. And any new fields in that new data sets will be added into your new data set, and the old data columns will be there, but the new columns will be coming into your data source. So if there is a red color or exclamatory mark kind of thing, and that means it has some error inside it and you need to rectify that. So we will see what kind of errors we will get whenever we're working on the replacing of data source and how to rectify them. And you might have to check the table calculations whenever you're replacing the data source, because table calculations might go to the default versions to a new directions, and the pointer will be different, and we can actually map back to the field whatever they are created on the table calculations. So that will be fixed up. And the next one would be closing a data source. So closing a data source is completely deleting the data source from your entire workbook. And whenever your data source is deleted, you might not have the option to access the fields which are there inside the previous data source. So whenever you're deleting a data source, you have to make sure that any fields from your data source is not actually being used in whatever sheets or whatever you're using. But Tableau will throw an error saying that, okay, you're using some fields using which are, and you're going to delete the content, and what the fields are being used somewhere, and do you want to really delete that? So whenever you're closing a data source, it will ask you that. So if you're completely sure of what you want to close the data source, and okay, you're not sure that columns are not being used anywhere, you can just go to the data source and close the data source from there. Okay, so we will just look at how we are going to do these things in Tableau. So what if we have, let's just take a scenario of the data, like just go to the new data source, say Excel sheet, and take the practice file itself. Okay, right now we have full data, right? So we have 4 tabs inside our practice file, and we have consumer corporate data, we have home office data, we have returns data, and we have 4 different tabs. And I'm just going to connect the home office tab. So I'll just drag the home office tab onto my data source. So you can only see the home and office data content inside it. If you see the segment, this is only for home office. So I just went to the sheet, worked on some category, and if you just say segment, so I have some fields, I just created some fields, and I just want to see how the profit is going on. Okay, fields based upon the region, etc. And I also wanted to see the category inside the region, and I'm just creating a simple data source to understand what is the need to actually replace a data source. Okay, in this case, we are in segment, we have only home office, right? We only have one subset of data. So what is happening is we might want to connect the data source to a different data source, so which contains a new column, and it has new columns. In this case, we have new columns, but in case of new columns, you might have to go to the data source and connect to it, right? So we don't want to create a redundancy in here, and so many data sources coming up, which might degrade our performance. So we might have to replace the data source to whatever content we are already working on, and it is already there in the other sheet. So okay, right now I just have the home office one. So all the home office content is also present in the full data. And I don't have an option, and I don't have to do this again on this particular data set, right? So I can actually pick up on full data itself. And right now, this one should be replaced with this one, with this full data one. Okay. Let's make some errors purposefully. I'm just doing it purposefully to create some discrepancy in the data, and we might have to create some errors to just keep it an example. I'm just going to my practice file. This is just for the understanding purposes only, and I'm just renaming column names so the column names will not map up to our full data, to our data which is already there. So I'll just rename some part of inside the column names. Okay, I'm just saying segment. Let's create some discrepancy in the column of segment. I'll just rename it to something else. Maybe I just rename it to home office or something. So it will be a different column name. I'm just going to the category as well. I'm just renaming it to some other name, and I'll just save it as a separate file. Practice file and home office. Let's rename that to that. Save. So if I just join this home office, we have the home of practice file already connected from the practice file, right? So I will just go to a new data source. We just created a new sheet, right? So I'll just connect it to that. It's loading up. Oh. Okay, let's go to our home office data. We have two new different columns in here, right? So that will not map up with our already existing data set. So if I just take this, and if I want to replace this file with this file, right click on the data source and just say replace data source. So replacing data source will ask to current data source and the replacement data source, and what file do you want to replace it with. So you just click on the drop down. It will show all the available data sources in the drop down, and you can select any one from your drop down. Let's say home office practice file, and I want to replace it with the other one. Okay, replace. If you see here, the tick mark over here went to this one. So it said that, okay, I just replaced this one with the other data source, so the tick mark changed. Let's refresh the data once. Okay, let's check why are we not seeing the columns differently. Okay, I'm just removing it. So I'll take the full data. So the segment is home office is coming up. So because we changed the column names, and if we put our sheet here, so this one will be grayed out because we have some errors inside our sheets. So if you see the red marks over here, this one is showing the explanatory mark. We already replaced our data sources, right? So all the new sources or new columns will be coming up. So this one is picking up a different column, and the category is not there in the previous data source, right? So we have a column called category new in the new data source. If you also see the segment is also showing some error, and this one is not saying that this is not in your data. And it also says that every time in the calculation also it will not recognize the column if the column name is different. And if you see here, all the columns whatever you used inside the views will be coming as red. So in the space, if you see here, what we'll have to do here, you just have to right click on the column name, the previous old column name, and say replace references. So right now I'm just working on segment. So I want to replace my segment column with a new column. And I completely know that my segment is actually this one. So I can replace my column with this new segment home office, and whatever the content is inside the segment will be the same. So I will just club this two columns. So the segment home office will be coming up here. So the segment is already gone if you see here. So wherever you use the segment in the views will be replaced by segment home office. And we have the same scenario with the category. So go to the category, say replace references, and say category new is the actual column you have to pick up. If you see here, you can actually see the data right now. So all the red marks are gone because you pointed out the data to the new column which has the same data. And that one picked up, even if you have 100 changes in the column, it will go to the everywhere and it will replace this column with a new column. So if you have this kind of errors, I always advise to replace the column name rather than going to the column and replacing the column onto the views. So if you have like too many sheets, it is actually more difficult to drag and drop and everything. So if you know what the column name is and what data it contains inside, it is very easy to replace the column name to the new column name. So this one will do all the replacements for you. So this is how you replace the data source, and this scenarios will come up whenever you have the new data inside your data set. Like we have new columns and you just got the columns with a different name, and you can actually add directly the data source, and you can actually replace the old data source with a new data source. So this is how you replace a new data source in your data set. So you can actually delete the data source, the old data source, which is not being in use right now. So how are we going to do that? We are just going to click the right click on the data source, say close. But what happens if you use some fields in this particular data source? Say I'm just writing the category. Category is being used in the sheet file. So what I'm doing right now, so what I will just do is I'll just go to this previous worksheet, and this one is showing a blue tick mark on our main data source, and I want to close the secondary data source, which ever is. If you see this is a pop-up box and it shows you the error that it is being used in the other sheets. When you close this data source, the following sheets might be defected. Like if you're using some column from your data source which cannot be deleted because you are already using the data into some other sheets. So if you're completely sure that you're not using the data anywhere, you can actually close the data source. But if you're already using some column in somewhere in your workbook, this one will show you an error and you can't close the data source because you're using that. And if you just close the data source forcefully, you can't use the data source again. And you will also lose the content in whichever sheet it is being used. So in this say, it said that we have some columns used in other sheets. So what if we forcefully close the data source even if we have some columns used in some other sheets? If you see here, the data source is disappeared and the sheet also disappeared. So it will directly delete the sheet, and if you have so many worksheets connected to the data source which are being used, closing the data source will close all the other sheets which are being used. So you wouldn't know what sheet is actually deleted in this case scenario. So in this case, you might actually have some sheets wherever there is a data source which is already being used, and you have some columns which are used in other sheets. You might not see which sheet got deleted in this case. So whenever you're closing a data source, it is like really careful to close a data source by checking each and everything. So this is how you can close the data source, and we will also discuss on some scenarios which might be useful. And so whenever you're working with multiple data sources, and you might see some red marks whenever you close the data source and new columns being up which is not mapping with your existing data, and you will see the red maps and all the columns whatever you bring up from the data source will be mapped up. But if you see the red columns, and that is saying that columns are not mapped up. And if you have some different names or column names in the new data source coming up, but it is not mapping up with the new data source whatever you connected, so just replace them by replace references by repointing them to the new data columns. So whenever you're using with the calculated fields, inside the calculated fields you're using some columns, and if that column is not mapping up, you just have to find that column name and go inside the calculated name, check the what column name you're actually using, and you have to repoint the column name to the new column name. This might fix your calculated field. So I'll just repoint the column name inside the calculated field into the new one, but you can't change the column name. If you want to create a new calculated field by just dragging up the new column to every calculated field, that will be a burdensome. So if you just check out the column name and replace it to the point to the new one, it will be very beneficial and it will be very easy. And also, if you create a group on that particular column and you added this new data source scenario, and if you're not seeing the column, this one group will work. So in this scenario, you might have to create a new group because it will not pick up the old column name which is already there because you had got a new column. And the sets also will be based upon the new column name when you're also working with the sets. And same goes with the parameter calculations, because parameter calculations is also dependent upon the calculation, and that in the calculation you're already using the old column, and if you have a new column, that will not recognize the new column. And in this case you have to check the parameter calculation and see the column name whatever it is using, repoint the column name to the new one whatever you have, and this will fix your parameter also. So the next one can be coming from a table calculations. If you see here, if you use any measure over here, the table calculations will use some scenario to point out to a column. This one will work according to the columns whatever the table calculation is created and computes the current value as a percentage of the totals summarize values from category, segment, etc. So what if you have the table calculation which is not recognizing the column you're using, because you have a new column name coming up in your data source, right? So it will not understand that it is a new column that I should connect it to. So if you see here, I will create a calculation based upon the percent on total, and this one is actually compute using category. So let's say this complete table calculation is computing the calculation based on the category, right? So it is giving us the percent of total based upon the category, and if you see it threw a red mark over here. So the field you're using for the table calculation is not existing. So it is not recognizing the column name. In this scenario, what happens if you just click on category, replace references, and if I just go to category new, this one will go pick up the column name as category new. So this category one scenario, if you just have different columns, you just have to replace the data source and you already replaced all the column names with the right ones. And even then you're just seeing some error over here in measures. It can be because the table calculations are not pointed to in the right way. You just have to go to the compute using and point to whatever field you're using for the table calculation. So do not panic whenever there is a red mark over there. This is only because the table calculation is not picking up the right column, and you just have to point it out to the new column. So this is like one more case scenario whenever you're working with the replace data sources. So let's conclude our week's topic. And in this week, we just learned about the ways to distribute in Tableau Company and Tableau Public inside the organizations and Tableau Public, and how we have to distribute our dashboards onto Tableau Server and Tableau Online. We just saw how to distribute on Tableau Public by creating a Tableau Public account, and we saw the process of exporting the data into various formats. Let's take an example of data, cross-tab, image, PDF, PowerPoint, etc. These are all exporting options you have inside Tableau Desktop and also onto the Tableau Public option. You can download it from there. You can download it from Tableau Desktop because the users might not have the desktop option all the time. So the users can access on Tableau Public and download it from there. So the third one we covered in this week is what are the different workbook file types and how are we sharing them based upon the Tableau extensions. We can share a TWB file, but it won't give all the data inside it. So if you want to share the Tableau file with all the Tableau content, you have to share it with twbx file. And we looked at publishing data sources and how to publish data sources, how to save them in Tableau Public, and how will your account look like, etc. And we talked about replacing the data sources and also the closing the data sources. Replacing the data source might replace with a new data source which is not used up you might need to close the old one, right? So we just saw how to replace the data source and close the data source. Why are we using this and everything? So how we can use in different scenarios, etc. So this is for this week, and thank you so much. We will be working on a project and we will be creating a new dashboard and publishing it to the Tableau Public after this. Thank you so much.